Good afternoon and welcome to Euronews Now. It's Monday, the 20th of December. Here are your top stories this hour. Governments across Europe weigh Christmas COVID restrictions as protests against stricter rules turn violent in Belgium. What next for post-Brexit talks as British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss takes over discussions with the EU from Lord Frost? And the Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai denies making sexual assault claims, saying her post on social media was misunderstood.
As European governments tighten restrictions to try and delay the spread of the Omicron variant, thousands of protesters continue to resist what they see as infringements on their liberty. In Brussels on Sunday, the city centre was once again blocked. It had been largely a peaceful gathering, but it ended once again in scuffles with police. The Belgian government is urging all residents to get vaccinated, and healthcare workers have a 3-month window to get a shot beginning January the 1st or risk losing their jobs.
This is the same message as past demonstrations. That's to say, stop the vaccination obligation for medical workers and also stop the COVID certificate.
But in Austria, hundreds were out on the capital streets for a different reason. They were lighting candles to remember the 13,400 deaths in the country from COVID. Stricter travel rules are being imposed from today, even as a lockdown ends, with Vienna being the last part of the country to reopen. But with Omicron on the march, the question is for how long?
Well, on one hand, the COVID situation in Germany is improving. The number of new infections per day have declined over the last 2 weeks, and that is obviously a good sign. However, there is a real fear here that before this fourth Delta-driven wave really goes down and disappears, a new fifth wave, an Omicron wave, will take over and will really hit the country. And that will then hit the country as hospitals are still struggling with the aftermath of this fourth wave. And that is causing real concern here in Germany. And that's why the government will meet with the state government leaders tomorrow to discuss new restrictions. They will perhaps put a cap on the number of people meeting outdoors and indoors, and perhaps other restrictions that will come into place. Now, short term, Germany has also placed the UK on its top level of travel restrictions. The UK is now classed as a virus variant area because of the fast spread of the Omicron variant in that country. And that means that only people living in Germany or German nationals are allowed to fly directly from the UK to Germany. And all of those will have to spend 14 days in home quarantine, and that's irrespective of any negative tests they might present or any vaccination status. It's just simply 14 days home quarantine for anyone arriving from the UK to Germany right now. Now, the hope is obviously that that will buy the country a bit of time to really get the booster campaign of the third shots going, to kind of make sure that this fifth wave is perhaps dulled a little bit and doesn't hit the country as hard as it otherwise would have. Now, it obviously remains to be seen if that is in any way going to work, this plan that Germany has put into place, or if the fifth wave will hit as people are worrying with full force when the hospitals are unprepared for new patients. Jonah Calgren, Euronews, Berlin.
She declared her opposition to Brexit in 2016, but in a strange turn of events, Liz Truss will now take over from Lord Frost to be Britain's chief Brexit negotiator with the EU. Truss is currently serving as the country's foreign secretary. While in the position, she negotiated post-Brexit deals with the likes of Australia and Japan. Given this pedigree, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has asked her to take on the vacant role. And what of Lord Frost? In his resignation letter, he cited the government's new pandemic restrictions as among the reasons for walking away. During his time as chief negotiator, he was known for his confrontational style, as he tried to get a new deal with the EU after the country already signed a Brexit agreement. With Truss's appointment, Boris Johnson will be looking to steady the ship following weeks of political turmoil within his government.
This week as you were doing last week. That's just good. Unbelievable.
Prosecutors began explaining evidence concerning the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine in July 2014. 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian are charged with murder, although none of the suspects are present at the trial. The attack happened as the war in the Donbass region of Ukraine got underway between separatists allegedly backed by Russia and the Ukrainian government. All 298 passengers and crew on board were killed. After piecing back together the wreckage of the plane, prosecutors alleged that the jet was brought down by a Buk missile from a Russian anti-aircraft unit. Russia denies any involvement in the downing. Some residents of a Ukrainian village close to the site where the jet crashed believe that peace in the region would have prevented the disaster.
When the plane crashed, my friends and I were 15 to 16 years old. We were young, we were still kids. We saw enough. It's all because of the war. If the war hadn't started here, there would have been no victims. Everything would have been different.
As tensions soar between Moscow and the West over a Russian troop build-up near Ukraine, those at the trial are reminded of the horrors that war can bring on unsuspecting, innocent civilians. Orbiting high above Earth, Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa, his producer and a Russian cosmonaut bid farewell to the crew of the International Space Station after spending 12 days there. The trip marks the first self-paid tourist visit to the spacecraft since 2009 and is mooted to cost a staggering $80 million.
And there you see it, undocking.
Mr. Maezawa said that once you're in space, you realize how much it's worth by having this amazing experience. He also deflected criticism that the money could have been spent on worthier causes back on Earth, saying that those who criticize his trip have never been to space. The capsule made a soft landing in the steppes of Kazakhstan. Mr. Maezawa, who made his fortune in the fashion industry, has also booked a flyby around the moon with Elon Musk's Starship. That trip is likely to happen in 2023.
Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai has denied being sexually assaulted by a former retired Communist Party leader. Last month, she allegedly claimed that ex-Vice Premier Zhang Guoli coerced her into having sex. But in speaking to Singapore press in her first interview since the scandal erupted, she said her social media post has been misunderstood. Peng became the center of a media storm as stars from the game demanded news about her whereabouts and the role of the IOC after she disappeared for 2 weeks. Chinese media have repeatedly published photos of the player in recent weeks, but their authenticity raised serious doubts. But on Sunday, when asked by a journalist if she has been able to move freely, Peng said she's always been free and that she's been living at her home in Beijing.
British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has started her new job as lead negotiator in post-Brexit talks with the EU after Lord Frost resigned as Brexit minister. He stepped down over the government's COVID policy, although he'd been reportedly persuaded to stay on until January, until the news was leaked on Sunday. Truss's first task will be to decide whether this is the time to change direction and reset the UK's tense relationship with the EU. I'm joined now by Euronews correspondent Tig Enright in London. Tig, hi, thanks for being with us today. So, what more can you tell us about Truss?
Hi, Andrea. Well, I think probably the most interesting element of Liz Truss's background is that she is somebody who back in 2016 campaigned for the UK to remain in the European Union. And now she is the one who's been sent into a battle, as it were, with Brussels about the future of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Compare that with her predecessor, indeed all of her predecessors, who were fierce critics of the European Union. So I think the hope, maybe not quite the expectation, but the hope is that she might be less ideologically driven, perhaps more pragmatic when it comes to finding a resolution to this dispute. Certainly the noises that we're hearing coming out of Dublin is that they think Liz Truss will be easier to deal with than David Frost. Even if she is a professed Brexiteer now, you have to be among Boris Johnson's top team. And indeed, much of her previous experience in government has prepared her for this role. She was at one point Environment and Agriculture Minister, and previous to her current role as Foreign Secretary, she was at the Department for International Trade, where her job was negotiating trade deals. And in her time there, she rolled over many of the trade deals that the UK benefited from under its EU membership and did negotiate new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. At the time, she famously, or people close to her, tried to brief newspapers as she pushed the Australian negotiator in an uncomfortable chair. Now, how successful has she been in negotiating trade deals? Well, that's open to interpretation, I think you could say. But I think it is fair to say that on the European side, they are happier to be talking to her rather than David Frost. And keep in mind as well, she is still Foreign Secretary. That's a very important, time-consuming job. The question I'd have is that suggests that the UK is hoping that she'll be wrapped up with these negotiations pretty quickly.
Afghanistan's economy is in free fall, according to a UN emergency relief coordinator, with tens of millions of people facing hunger. It's been 4 months since the Taliban returned to power, and there's no effective policy from the international community over how to deal with a Taliban-led government. Owen Loy from the new Humanitarian magazine joins me now on International Human Solidarity Day. Thanks for being with us on the programme. Afghanistan is on its knees at the moment. How much longer is the international community going to press on with the sanctions policy, or is there an alternative it can come up with?
Well, I think that's the key question facing Afghanistan. You know, as you said, it's been more than 4 months since the Taliban surge, and there's still no real answer in how, foreign governments, mainly Western foreign governments who formally backed the previous regimes in Afghanistan, how they're going to deal with the Taliban-led government. And that's really having a direct impact on everyday lives. You talked about some of the consequences. Hunger is widespread and growing. The economy and health sectors are collapsing. There are cash shortages, and nearly the entire population might plunge below the poverty line next year, according to a few UN estimates. I think things were dire before the Taliban surge, and that's key to mention. This is not just something that happened overnight. There was a severe drought that was putting about half the population in crisis mode already, and it's pretty unclear if the Taliban had the skills to run the country. And obviously there are major fears about what life will be like, or life is like, under the Taliban, especially for women. But I think it's the international response to the Taliban's rise that has really pushed the country to the brink, to the point where aid groups are using language like world's worst and warning of famine coming in the coming months. And that's definitely a situation that's escalated by these sorts of sanctions and the reluctance or inability for agencies to get money into the country, and for Afghanistan to get its own money into the country. So I think there are solutions, there are workarounds, but right now I think there are still lots of questions, and it's really come down to humanitarian aid agencies who are not really built to prop up an entire nation for this level of crisis to kind of weather the storm for the time being.
And it's kind of a vicious circle, isn't it? The more the economy collapses, the more aid it needs, and the more it would become dependent upon aid, and the harder it is to kind of kickstart the economy.
That's right. I think it is this cycle. Donors, I think, have essentially shifted the job of propping up the country through foreign aid from these larger development budgets managed by the World Bank and others to much smaller humanitarian ones. You know, humanitarian aid is by nature short-term. It's emergency-based. It's not supposed to be something that runs a country for you know, months on end, and certainly years on end. And the budgets are much smaller. So I think it's the more the economy collapses, as you say, it feeds into this cycle. And so aid groups built for short-term aid are kind of responding to the fallout of long-term needs. And so you have this cycle where the sanctions or the worry about breaking sanctions are really adding to the problem while humanitarian needs are getting worse.
The Premier League shareholders are meeting today to discuss the COVID situation after 6 of 10 top-flight games were postponed over the weekend. Clubs may decide to suspend the next round of games. So far, matches have been considered on a case-by-case basis, but there's been criticism of that approach. I'm joined by Euronews sports reporter Michael Kern. Hi, Michael. Thanks for coming on the programme today. So, shareholders are meeting today. What's likely to come out of the talks, and are their concerns different from those of players and managers?
Yeah, do you know, I think this decision is going to be incredibly interesting. Of course, in the United Kingdom, cases of COVID are going up. And I think the number one concern, especially when you hear from the managers, is about that player welfare, which is obviously something we talk about lots, you know, when we talk about the amount of games they have to play. Player welfare is incredibly important. Chelsea yesterday tried to get a request in to get their game postponed as well. So it's going to be very interesting what decision the Premier League make. But there's so many different factors that come into this. Of course, player welfare is key. And that's not just when it comes down to their safety with catching COVID and the staff they work with. But then you've got to rearrange these games. And is it going to be too many games? We've got a very busy year coming up in 2022 with the World Cup as well. You've then got the aspect with the club as well. You know, they've got staff that are employed and revenue that has to be gained from those fixtures. Calling it off last minute isn't helpful to anyone. So I think if they're going to make a decision, it has to be a yes or no, well ahead to give fans, players, staff and everyone the correct amount of time to prepare efficiently and safely for what they need to do.
As you mentioned, it's already a packed schedule. So if they do decide to postpone the next round of games, how will they fit them all in?
It's that $1 million question, right, isn't it? Because once you come back after Christmas, the FA Cup kicks back in for the clubs in the top tiers. You've also got Carabao Cup fixtures to fit in. There's always a busy period. You've got players that are potentially off to the Africa Cup of Nations as well. So literally, you look at that timetable and think, where are they going to go? But I think the most important thing is, like we saw before, obviously in 2020, that, you know, everyone's safety and welfare is more important than the Premier League competition as a whole. You know, life and people's health is more important. So I think it'll be very difficult to see how they'll fit them all in, but I'm sure they'll make some adjustments to make that possible if they do decide to postpone them.
That's it for now, but do stay with us as we bring you all the latest from across Europe and beyond. You can also find out more on our website, that's euronews.com.